Hi, my name's Cassie Nobbs. I'm a physiotherapist at Comox Physiotherapy in beautiful British Columbia, Canada, on Vancouver Island. This is Healthy Movement with Physio Cassie. My passion is helping people find healthy movement options to improve their quality of life, whether that means running your first marathon or gardening without pain. Hi there, welcome to video 2 in my running injury prevention series. This series is intended to be a series of approximately 4 or 5 videos geared towards the couch to 5K group for the Comox Valley Road Runners. So as such, the intended audience are beginner runners to intermediates that haven't had much coaching. If you fall into that category, sit tight. I'm sure this video will be very interesting to you. If not, if you're more of an elite runner and you've had a lot of coaching in the past, this may not be for you. Though, we're still going to cover some of the basics, and it's always good to review the basics. Maybe you want to hang on anyway. Let's begin. So this is the why portion of this video. Just like video 1, there's going to be a why portion and then a how portion. The how portion is going to go over some drills that you can incorporate into your running warm-up that will set you up nicely for improving your running form during your regular run. So why do we need to work on form? What is the deal and how does that tie into overuse injury? Well, overuse injury is essentially repetitive stress on tissues that takes that tissue beyond the threshold of the forces it can withstand. So you can have one big incident. So remember how we talked about traumatic injuries where I'm running along and I trip and I fall and I stick my hand out and maybe I break my wrist. That's a high force in a short period of time that caused a fracture of the bone. You can also have overuse injuries, which are smaller forces, but they're repeated over and over and over and over again. They're still adverse forces, but just once or twice, it's probably not going to do anything. But when you're out for that run, when you're out for that 5K run, that's a lot of steps. And over a lot of steps, eventually something's going to break down. So I have a couple of analogies for you to help you think about this and why form is important. So the first one is a angled nail versus a straight nail. So if you have a straight nail and I use my hammer and punk, 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 I plunk it into the ground or into a piece of wood, that straight nail is going to go straight down in there and the forces are going to be transferred well. If I have a bent nail and I hit that nail with my hammer, punk, 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 then eventually that nail where it's bent is likely to bend farther and you'll damage the actual metal of the nail. So my visual here is this cane. So I have this lovely cane that has a nice little side hook in it. If I was to hit this over and over and over and over again, eventually what's going to happen is you would see fracturing of the metal on this side and you'd see compression damage to the metal on this side. The same thing happens to our tissues. When they're loaded in ways that they're not meant to take load, they'll either sustain traction injuries, which is often what happens with chronic tendinitises or tendinopathies, to use a better word, or you can also have compression injuries, which is sometimes what happens to the bone, or you can even have traction injuries to the bone. Compression and traction injuries are both 2 ways that you get stress fractures. So that is one analogy. So the other analogy is imagine a rope. So I've got this rope, and in this case I don't have a rope, but I do have a piece of TheraBand. So I've got this TheraBand, and let's pretend it's a rope, and I'm going to pull it, 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 and over time, eventually, the structure of this is going to break down, just like anything else does from mechanical stress. Now, what's amazing about the human body is that we can do this a lot, and as long as we rest it enough, our bodies will build new tissue and recover. If we don't rest it enough, or if we do this too many times in one go, such that it goes past the capacity of that tissue, it will start to tear and break down or become inflamed. So I'm going to combine both of these things now. So now I've got my TheraBand. This is my tissue that's going to get traction on it. And now here is a hip joint. So if I take this here, put this over top of here, and go like so. Now if I land on my leg and my knee goes inwards, I'm going to strain that TheraBand every time I hit the ground. And if I land on my leg, maybe my knee stays relatively still, but my pelvis drops, the same thing is going to happen. So over time, that tissue here is going to get irritated, or maybe it gets irritated down here, or maybe it gets irritated up here. But somewhere within that mechanism, you will see mechanical stress-related damage to the tissue, unless it's rested, and then your body can recover, and that feeds into the progression of training, which is super important. Later video. All right, so now to bring that back to what happens when we're running, if I land on my leg, boom. Remember I said if the knee goes in, that's the knee coming in. My pelvis is pretty level, but if my knee does this over and over again, this is going to hurt, or this might hurt, or this might hurt, or my foot might hurt, or maybe even my back. Now, maybe I land on the foot, and rather than the knee collapsing inward so much, maybe my pelvis does this. Well, guess what? Boom, 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 boom. Eventually my back is going to get sore, or my hip is going to get sore also. So these are the types of forces that we're trying to mitigate by doing form work. So ideally, when you're working on your running form, you're trying to correct these types of adverse forces. Now, I've just only been using examples that show sort of what we call frontal plane, which is this plane of motion. As I move here, I'm moving kind of side to side. But we actually move in 3 planes. So another plane of motion would be sagittal plane, which is moving forwards and moving backwards. Right? And the other plane is rotation, so twisting. And yes, we are supposed to twist when we run a certain amount. That's normal. It actually helps our tissues propel us forwards and also prevents injuries in other areas. So the rib cage is supposed to rotate, the pelvis not so much. If the rib cage doesn't rotate enough, you got to find the rotation someplace, so it ends up coming from the pelvis, and that can cause problems. So those are the reasons why we do form work. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the principles of correcting form faults next. Okay, so now we're going to specifically talk about form faults as they relate to planes of motion. So sagittal plane of motion is the first one we're going to cover. Sagittal plane of motion, if you remember from before, is forwards and backwards. It's moving through this direction. And it's what we need to propel us forward, so obviously it's really important. So there are 4 ways in which I see a very common repeated issues with form in the sagittal plane. One is where the foot is contacting the ground at the initial contact phase, so as your foot comes down and it lands on the ground. Another is what happens with the leg as you go through what we call mid-stance, which is here, and then lastly, what happens when you push off. And then what happens when your foot comes through and goes to contact the ground again. Most important of these 4 form issues is the initial contact point. So when your foot hits the ground, your whole leg has to receive quite a lot of force from the ground. So anything we can do to decrease those forces at that initial contact point is likely to reduce the stress on your tissues and therefore decrease the probability that you're going to have an injury. It also improves your performance. All of these form things actually improve your performance, but I'm not so geared on performance as I am on wanting you to not get injured. Being injured as a runner is just a huge bummer. Nobody wants that. Okay, so initial contact. So when you come, what I see very commonly is people come through and they land here with their foot a fair ways in front of the pelvis. So if you're striking the ground in front of the pelvis, what happens is the weight of your body is still trying to move forwards, and the forces of the ground are pushing not just upwards through your foot, but backwards. So you're getting shearing forces through the joints. You're getting shearing forces through the knee, through the hip, through the pelvis, and through the low back. That's not great. Obviously, we want to get rid of any kind of shearing forces through the joints. Also, there's a tendency to land on the heel when you do that. So you swing the foot forward, the tendency is to heel strike, boom. And when you hit that heel strike, it takes away some of your shock absorption from the foot. So much better form has you landing on the foot underneath your pelvis, a little bit more here instead of here. So pelvis relative to feet. I've been talking about the foot relative to the pelvis, but now let's talk about where the pelvis is. So my foot's coming down, my pelvis is forwards on it. My pelvis is forwards on it. My pelvis is forwards on it. So we really want that pelvis moving forwards over the feet. We're going to come back to that in a second. In order to get a sense of what I mean by this, I'd like you to try something for me. So I want you to do just a little hop and land, hop and land, hop and land, hop and land. And what you're going to do is you're going to land on the foot almost right under, with the foot almost right underneath your pelvis. You're barely going to move forwards. Now, instead, try hop and land on your heel with it just out in front of you just a little bit. Hop and land. And you can feel how it, not only does it stop you from moving forwards, it actually knocks you back a little bit. So that's why we want to get rid of that heel contact out in front. It's really not a great thing for most runners. So the next point that I'd like to make is about push-off. So most early runners tend not to push off behind them. So what I mean by that is the hips kind of hang back. So they sort of run like this. I'm sure you don't look like this, but that is kind of what it looks like sometimes. So the foot never really pushes forward. So again, it's all about pelvis relative to foot. So you want to get the pelvis forward relative to the feet. So you want to always feel like your hips are moving up and forwards. So as you come forwards, you're pushing up and forwards, forwards, forwards. I like to talk about something called goosing. So you know what it's like when somebody comes up, or maybe you don't, but maybe you can imagine. Somebody comes up behind you and they pinch your bum. What do? So somebody comes up behind me, I'm standing here talking to my friend, they pinch my bum and I go, ooh, like that. So I squeeze my glute and my pelvis moves forward away from the pinch. That's what you want when you're running. So every single time you land on that leg, it's a goose, 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 goose. And in fact, when I was first learning to change the way that I was running, I used to do this with my fingers. Goose, 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 as I ran to remind myself to contract that glute and push off so that the pelvis is moving forwards relative to the feet. The mid-stance piece, usually people collapse a little bit through too much through the knee. I'm not going to work too much on that because a lot of the drills and things that we do for any of the form faults will help to work on that. So the next bit we're going to talk about is frontal plane faults. So frontal plane faults is frontal plane, moving in this plane, right? We talked a lot about all of this already when we talked about why form is important for running. So the most common thing is that as you land on the leg, there's some form of what we call frontal plane collapse. And frontal plane collapse can mean that the pelvis drops, or it can mean that the knee goes in, or it can mean that the foot over-pronates. Or maybe it doesn't, or maybe it pronates too long in the gait cycle. Regardless, what it is a lack of movement control in this direction. So I'm going to put this foot out to maybe have you be able to see it better. So this sort of thing. So you're kind of collapsing into that knee and that hip. And you can see how I'm loading the inside of my foot and my pelvis is dropping down. Now again, I'm giving you a very extreme example, but I'm going to show you a little bit from behind. It looks kind of like this. Collapse, collapse. So the pelvis drops, the knee goes in. So for that one, there are lots of drills to do that, and mostly it's about gaining some strength through the hip area or through the foot and through the core. Core is later, but lots of the drills that I introduce towards the end of this video in the how section will help to correct some of these things. So last but not least is the transverse plane issue. And the transverse plane issue is important in that, as I mentioned previously, if you don't have enough trunk rotation, we have to have rotation come from someplace or else running and gait don't work. So if you don't have enough trunk rotation, the rotation has to come somewhere. So if I'm holding my shoulders too still, usually what happens is my pelvis starts to do this kind of a thing. And now I've got all kinds of adverse stuff going on, which also ties into some of my frontal plane faults that I didn't talk about, which are crossing over. You don't want to be doing this while you're running. That's not good for your knees and your hips, or your waist or your back. Swing phase form faults aren't as important as stance phase form faults in terms of injury, with exception of one thing. So if you have Poor control with your hamstrings towards late swing. That's this part. So your foot's come through, you're kicking out. Your hamstrings has to contract to grab the ground here and stabilize your leg in that transition from swing to initial contact. If you don't have good control in this motion, you can sometimes have chronic hamstring issues. So there is a drill to target that type of motion control in the how section as well. Hopefully that gives you an idea of the types of form faults that we're looking for. So the next section of this video goes into drills that we can use to help to correct some of those form faults. This quick little insert is to let you know that I have not forgotten about cadence. Cadence is important. So important, in fact, that it warrants its own video. So stay tuned for Injury Prevention for Runners, Part 2B, Cadence. All right, let's move to the hows of the drills. This is the prancing pony drill. The key here is to get the feet high up underneath the sit bones. The foot lands underneath the pelvis, and there are short, quick steps. The goal here is to improve your contact point at initial contact phase. This drill is the cross arm drill. The goal here is to take the arms away, forcing the runner to find better stability and control through the trunk and the pelvis. It is also intended to help encourage some rotation through the rib cage while stabilizing the hip girdle. You'll notice how much more stable I am through the waist. Skipping drill. The goal here are low skips with quick feet, landing the foot underneath the pelvis, again getting used to the idea of high knees with an initial contact phase, pelvis over feet or feet under pelvis. Line drill. This is super helpful for correcting crossing over of the feet or the torso and learning to control movement in the frontal plane. So if you're a narrow runner or a crossing over runner, this is a great drill for you. Hurdle drill. This is a 1-2 step, 1-2 up, 1-2 up, 1-2 up. And the idea is to take 2 steps and then 1 high knee step similar to the prancing pony. This is considered a transition drill in between the prancing pony and regular running. This is the hip hike. The idea is to shift your weight over to one leg, get stable on that leg, and then you're going to reach up to the sky on the same side, stretch through that standing side. The pelvis lifts in the non-weight bearing side. So in this case, I'm going to lift my left knee. The left side of my pelvis is going to come up, and as I lengthen through the right side of my body. Lengthening through the standing leg, lifting on the non-weight bearing leg. So from behind, what you don't want to see is the pelvis drop, so dropping on the left. The correct way to do it is to reach and lengthen as you lift up on the left. This is a staggered stand with rotation. It's meant to improve mechanics at push-off, particularly rotating the trunk with activation of the glute. So you take a step, freeze frame like you're about to push off of the, in this case, the left leg. Pelvis stays nice and stable, cross the arms, and now you're going to cross to the right while the pelvis does not move. As you're doing that, you're squeezing the glute to stabilize the pelvis. So from the side, taking a step, freeze framing, really squeezing that glute on the left side as I rotate to my right, keeping my pelvis nice and stable. If I don't stabilize my pelvis, it looks like this with the hips coming around. Don't want that. Stabilizing with the glute and nice stable pelvis. Last drill is kickouts. This is to help train your hamstring to control the end phase of swing, so the foot comes up like in mid-swing, and then you kick out towards the object that you're leaning against. Notice I've got about a 10-degree trunk lean, which is also considered good form. You can go a little slower to begin with and then try to go a little quicker and still control it and keep that knee high. So how do we put this all together? Ideally, what you would do is you would have your 5 to 6 minute dynamic warm-up that we talked about in video 1, or maybe you've worked out with a coach. There's lots of different dynamic warm-ups out there. And then you would add in some running drills. So 5 to 6 minutes of dynamic warm-up, and then you would do about 10 minutes of running drills. Usually what I do is I pick 2 drills that look like they work best for a person. And then we do those drills for 30 seconds on, 30 seconds rest, and 5 times through. That's 5 minutes for one drill, and then another 5 minutes for drill number 2. So overall, your lead-in prep work before you even go for your run is about 15 minutes. After that 15 minutes, you go off on your run. Now, let's say you had a run that was planned to be 30 minutes. You could include that 15 minutes as part of your run. So you do 15-minute warm-up and then do your 15-minute run, and then hopefully you'd have a bit of a cool down also at the end of that run. Finally, here comes the awkward self-promotion piece. I do one-on-one consultations all the time for runners, other types of athletes, regular Joes, grandmas just trying to get up off the ground. If you're interested in having a consultation with me, those can be done in person. We have COVID protocols in place for that if you're in the Comox Valley area. If you're not in the Comox Valley area, I am doing telehealth consultations, and as you can see, the video format actually works pretty well. And you could even take a video of yourself running and send it to me. I could analyze it and send the video analysis back to you. I hope that's helpful. If you are interested in booking an appointment, please contact us through comoxphysio.com. Thank you.